worlds, and this hollow Earth idea doesn't just rely on Operation High Jump, does it?
No, definitely not. And that's what I was commissioned to write the Admiral Byrd book. I really felt it would have been remiss not to also go into the whole Hollow Earth mythology, because the idea that there is another world beneath our feet has been with us in myths and legends probably from the very beginning. If you look at practically any society and civilization's creation myths, they have people either coming from the stars or coming from underneath the earth, from caves or holes or something along those lines. So when it comes to the Hollow Earth mythologies, they play an important factor within our really how we developed as humans. It plays an important role just as much as the idea that, we were brought here by aliens from other planets.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and when you dig into it, a lot of bright minds have considered that the Earth could be hollow. In your book, you mentioned 17th century astronomer and mathematician Sir Edmund Halley, who calculated the orbit of Halley's Comet.
Mm-hmm.
Also, German scientist Athanasius Kircher would be another one. Is there anything else we could say about bright minds who found this possibility worth exploring or had this belief?
Well, you have to understand also that in the times of, say, like Halley, when he was working on his concept, and his concept was that the Earth was almost like Russian nesting dolls. It had spheres within spheres within spheres.
Mm-hmm.
These were the early days of geology and trying to understand, how the Earth was made up. Here in modern times, we have, supposedly, I'll have to take their word for it, a better understanding on how the Earth is made up. Just the fact that they're able now to use earthquakes to determine what certain layers of the planet are made up of, it's absolutely fascinating. So when you look back at some of these early conceptions of the Earth and the possibility that it could be hollow, like I said, before, you have to take into mind that we didn't have a really great understanding of just, how planets were formed and how our planet is made up. But I need to point out also, Greg, that, by no means do we have a perfect understanding of what's underneath our feet. We've got a kind of a general idea, but we've never been able to go much further than, say, I think maybe, 3 to 5 miles, I think, is the deepest that we have managed to dig down. So there's still a lot of unknown factors when it comes to understanding, what's inside our planet.
Mm-hmm. Good points. And also, it's fair to say that what's known isn't necessarily what's given out to the masses either.
Oh, well, that's true. When I first became interested in the whole Hollow Earth mythology, I think that was one of the first things I really, became interested in, besides, say, like UFOs and, ghosts and things like that. One of the first books I ever bought, just wildly enough, happened to be a book written by Timothy Green Beckley, who I work with quite a bit now. And his book was about the Hollow Earth and the Richard Shaver Zero mysteries. And so, I got off to a rich start, on this kind of stuff really early on. And, the concept that the planet is hollow, say like an eggshell, that we live on, the surface, and then the crust is maybe 500 to 1,000 miles thick, and then the rest of it is hollow with maybe a sun in the center and continents and water and, people and animals living on the inside. I'm less inclined now to believe that, but more inclined to accept the idea that the Earth is crisscrossed at various levels with tunnels and vast caverns and, things like that, more along the lines of, say, like Journey to the Center of the Earth. by Jules Verne, rather than, and I don't know if you're familiar with these books, but Edgar Rice Burroughs, the guy who wrote Tarzan, he wrote a series of adventure books called the Pellucidar series. And his Pellucidar is, the old concept, like I was just talking about, of a hollow earth. There's a sun in the center, and there's, people and prehistoric animals living there, and there are openings in the North and South poles that people can get in and out. And if you ever read these books,
yeah, some of them.
Yeah, I highly recommend them. I highly recommend your listeners read them as well, because he really, obviously Burroughs did his research for his days. I think these books were written in like maybe the 1920s, 1930s, that sort of thing. So, all of the myths and legends about the hollow earth are included in his books and are really, just a good treaty to read if you want to know about some of these early 20th century ideas of the hollow earth.
Mm-hmm.
Since I went off on a wild ramble here, you said whether or not some of this knowledge about a hollow earth may be kept secret from us, that is a possibility. I do think that it is being kept from us, that there are underground areas that, more along the lines, like I said, of tunnels and vast caverns. Some of them may actually have people living there that broke away from the human race a long time ago and kind of created their own civilization. Maybe people that are basically, Homo sapiens, or maybe cousins, still within the, hominid line, but not quite to, Homo sapiens like we are. Information like that, yes, definitely, I think is probably being kept secret from us.
Mm-hmm. Really, the most exciting thing about the hollow earth idea is just the idea that there's unexplored lands or unknown peoples on the earth or in the earth that we don't know of. So, yeah, I'm pretty impartial to if it's more like a giant ant farm or an actual hollow cavity, but I still do hold out hope for that hollow cavity thought. I guess they say when John Quincy Adams was president, he got really swept up in the idea, and apparently he approved an expedition to explore the inner earth, and some say that was a major reason he only served one term, because other people weren't necessarily on board. Congress wasn't on board. But I've also been told the Smithsonian, they say its original mission statement was related to displaying artifacts from this expedition that they say, never happened. So I guess it played a pretty decent role in people's minds in the past. And I also tend to think, like, what's true for one celestial body should be true for all of them to an extent. And when they crashed that thing into the moon, it rang like a bell. And apparently Mars moon Phobos seems to be hollow. And there is speculation that both of those things could just be ancient alien space bases. So maybe they aren't necessarily satellites or celestial bodies like the rest of them, but they are intriguing ideas.
Well, that you have to take into consideration, is the moon a natural object?
Right.
Because there's been talk for a long time, considering how large the Earth's moon is in comparison to other moons and their planets. Of course, Jupiter has moons that are, almost as big as, some of our smaller planets. But, you look at the size in comparison to Jupiter and these moons, and the Earth moon system is just wildly out of proportion in comparison with the rest of the solar system. It's almost a binary planet system. If the orbits were a little bit different, it would be a binary planet system. But the idea that the moon is hollow was brought about by several Russian astronomers back in the early 1960s. And then when you had, like you said, when they crashed some of the spent boosters from the Saturn V rockets onto the surface of the moon, it did seem to indicate that there's something unusual about the composition of the moon. Possibly, some people have said that the moon was actually like a giant spaceship,
right,
that brought us here to this planet from someplace else, or maybe it's a like a spent Death Star.
I love it.
Yeah, I don't necessarily believe that concept, but, considering how unusual the moon is in comparison with the other moons in the solar system. The way that it is perfectly set up that when it crosses the disk of the sun, it creates a perfect solar eclipse. I mean, things like that to me seem to be beyond coincidence.
Right.
It seems to be planned. For what reason? I don't know. But that's just one of many, examples that I have found over the years concerning, our planet, the moon, other planets, universe in general, that makes me think that there's more going on than a lot of our scientists are letting on. Possibly, they don't realize it themselves because most scientists nowadays are materialist, and anything that seems to counteract that idea, they're naturally going to shut down and not listen to it. And of course, any of these scientists who are interested in this kind of stuff, they kind of treat it like a hobby and don't tell anybody else about it because, boy, that's a great way to lose your tenure or any future funding if your peers ever find out that you're interested in, some of this fringe material, so to speak.
Yes. Cheers to that. And it is tough to know exactly what elements to put stock into, but it does seem a lot of the time like we are just living on one of the gears of the great cosmic grandfather clock. And you also mentioned in the book Marshall B. Gardner. He's a scientist who spent 2 decades studying the aurora borealis, and he said he was convinced that it came from light from inside the Earth. I think that is a provocative clue. Of course, the poles are fairly heavily guarded, and, there's all that speculation that we can't get there. We can't actually see holes, but we can see the aurora borealis, and it is interesting. Do you put any stock in that idea or not so much?
Not so much. I mean, I do accept the conventional idea that the aurora borealis is, the result of solar winds interacting with the Earth's magnetic field. However, there was an interesting picture that came out a few years ago of Antarctica. And this was a satellite picture, and it seemed to show the southern lights coming out of what appeared to be a rather large opening, not quite as large as, say, like a polar opening has been supposed by theorists on the hollow Earth, but still, like a large cave. And it seemed to show this electrified light coming out of it. So whether or not it's a situation where you're seeing, say, like an inner sun being reflected off of the polar ice, something like that is probably a little simplistic, I think. However, considering the way that the planet is wrapped with all kinds of electrical fields, fields of radiation, and things like that, if you do have openings of some kind that lead into the interior of the planet, more than likely you're going to find that these lines of force will also, move in and out of these openings. And of course, when you have these highly magnetic and electrified fields of force surrounding the planet, any interaction with the sun and other cosmic forces is going to create different kinds of lighting patterns, whether it's, like the electrified gases, like the aurora borealis, or something along those lines of fields of radiation even. So, I mean, I think that it is a possibility, but the idea that, like I said, like the inner sun is reflecting off the ice, that is probably less likely than, some of these other ideas that I just put forth.
Fair enough. Well, you're speaking my language. And I also wanted to ask you about this person, Dr. Wendy Lockwood. She wrote a piece that is actually chapter 9 in your book. And one provocative quote from that chapter is where she says that NASA certainly knows about the northern entrance to the hollow Earth, and I suspect HAARP may be directed at seeking ways to penetrate those inner worlds, which is a provocative idea. I'd never considered that HAARP could somehow be related. A lot of people also, especially in the legends and the mythology, consider anything under the umbrella inner Earth. They consider it almost like a more of a spiritual place of some type.
Mm-hmm.
But I just thought that was really interesting. I've heard a lot of thoughts about what HAARP could be. Never have I heard it, talked about in that way. But I also bring her up because I went to her website and there isn't really a ton there except for a few articles and a logo that looks a lot like many secret society logos, but it has a hollow earth on it. And it says, contact Dr. Wendy Lockwood if you'd like to know more about the Web of Light Mystery School. And the site seemed like it was connected to yours or Timothy Beckley's site, but it's just super provocative to me. Can you tell us anything more about her or this mystery school in particular?
Yes. Well, I should say that Dr. Lockwood, I haven't heard from her in quite a while. Gosh, I mean, I think the last time that I spoke with her was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And at that time, she was not in the best of health. So, I mean, I don't want to go on the air and say that she has possibly passed on because I don't know that for sure. But, that could be the situation.
Right.
And you're absolutely correct. Dr. Lockwood used to be a writer for Tim Beckley. She wrote articles for his old magazines and some chapters for some of his early books. And her teachings are more along the metaphysical lines, and her ideas of, say, like a hollow earth and places, like that tend to be, her idea is that they tend to be more on a spiritual or other dimensional realm. She thinks that there are physical entrances to the hollow earth, but that after you go, say, like a certain distance, then you actually are no longer in this sphere of reality, that, you're in a different plane of existence. And she speculates that, like all planets in our solar system, or not just our solar system, but probably throughout the universe, maybe operate along the same ways, that there is a connection to these other spheres of reality through these underground entrances, almost to the point where, say, like if you would go to, say, Mars and would find one of these underground entrances, you would go basically to the same reality as you would if you found the same type of cave entrance on the planet Earth. It's almost like, every portion of the real universe, the physical universe, no matter where you are, that there are entrances to these other dimensional states of reality. Anywhere that you go in this universe, you would end up in the same place. I don't know if I'm making myself clear or not.
Yeah. Portals, basically.
That's basically it. But it's you would just no matter where you would go in this universe, you would always emerge in the same place in whatever these other dimensional realms are. So I mean, it's an interesting theory, and it's another aspect of this that is interesting, in my opinion, is that, and I don't know if you're familiar with this writer, but there was a guy by the name of T. Lobsang Rampa, who wrote a number of books about Tibet and Tibetan mysticism, especially back in the 1950s. And, he continued to write into the 1960s as well. But he claimed that he lived as a Buddhist monk. I mean, he was born in Tibet and was brought into...
like a secret society?
Well, no, it's not. I mean, it's, like part of Tibetan Nepalese Buddhist tradition, but it goes a lot deeper into the mystical aspects of this Eastern philosophy. And one of the things that he wrote about was that he was taken into a cavern system in the Himalayas and was taken into basically, the hollow earth or some of these huge tunnel and cavern systems, to the underground civilization of Agartha, which is, like supposedly where like the great masters of the world reside. I mean, these are the immortal masters of the planet that I mean, basically they know all and see all and that sort of thing. The interesting part of this was that at one point he came to a portal of light and was asked to step into it. And when he did, he found that he was on another planet or another reality. I mean, it's difficult to discern just exactly where he was, but he didn't feel like that he was on planet Earth anymore, but he felt that he was in a place that was connected to all the planets and, all the physical realms on planet Earth, that they all led to this one kind of like, super mystical location. And he was basically told by these highly evolved beings. I mean, these beings were evolved to the point where they no longer had physical bodies. They were basically just like globes of light, just, like hyper intelligence. And they were told that it was mankind's function to eventually evolve to become like our concept of angels, and that our destiny would be to evolve into kind of like the state that these beings were in, to almost beings of pure energy, and that it would be our task to bring other life forms and intelligences to the same point, and that every intelligent species in this universe, our ultimate destiny is to lead others into this higher state of being, which would then, supposedly bring the completion of, whatever the creative force of the entire multiverse is. That we're all just kind of like sparks off of this creative force, and that our goal is to, help these other life forms to achieve the same goal. So, I mean, Rampa's story sounds very much like Dr. Lockwood's ideas. And of course, Dr. Lockwood, I mean, she says that there are physical underground locations, say under Mount Shasta, that there's an actual underground city there that was built a long time ago by remnants of what we would call Lemuria, which would be the Pacific version of Atlantis. That was a civilization that supposedly existed, a number, maybe a million or so years ago, but then for one reason or another sank into the ocean. And then the remnants of that civilization, scattered across the globe and kind of seeded, helped seed civilization from their knowledge. And one of these remnant cities is under Mount Shasta, which is now in California.
I love it. That's a great breakdown. And another story from the book that is kind of related to this that I was completely unfamiliar with. Apparently this guy, Pytheas, this Greek geographer from around 333 BC, apparently he sailed north as far north as he could through what he called the, quote, congealed seas, and he discovered a land he called Thule, or Thule, just like the old Nazi occultist society. But he said that the people there showed him the place where the sun goes to sleep, and he wrote about the landscape as a place where land, properly speaking, no longer existed, nor air or water, but a mixture of these things, as if it was like a marine lung in which all matter is in suspension, as if this something was a link between all these elements on which one could not walk or sail. And that's a hell of a story, man. And it kind of relates to that model you were just describing.
Yeah, it really does. And modern historians, I mean, they have no doubt that this guy actually existed, because at the time, and you have to realize, of course, that his writings no longer exist, but he was written about by his skeptics. The people who lived in his time when he came back and told his stories, he basically was ridiculed, and his skeptics wrote about it. Yeah, here's the crazy stories that this guy told us, that sort of thing. But if you go and kind of strip away the archaic writing and ideas that they had at the time, he basically was probably one of the first in like Greek or Western, early Western society to discover the northern polar regions. Naturally, I mean, you had the natives who lived up there, but, they didn't communicate very much, say, like with the ancient Greeks or anybody like that.
Right.
So when he went past the British Isles and sailed further north, he discovered there was icebergs floating around and that the days grew shorter. And, he got to the point where during the Arctic winter, the sun, either it never rose or it just, I think he reported that it actually just kind of like went along the horizon. It never got very high up. It just kind of rolled along the horizon and then went back down again. And then during the Arctic summer, it never set. And so when he came back with these stories, everybody made fun of him. Like, yeah, right. You obviously were drinking too much or whatever. But he did, like you said, he brought back the story of the land of Thule. And if you look at some of these other mythologies, especially, say like German mythology, says a lot about Thule. And then some of the more northern races that live, say, like in, Norway and Finland and, even some of the ancient peoples that live in Siberia, they have these similar stories of a land that exists extremely far north to the point where it almost seems like it's no longer part of the regular planet. The Inuits of North America, their creation mythology has it that they came from a land from the far north where the sun never set and it was always warm and there was an abundance of, food, and it was just really a pretty nice environment, which always makes me wonder why in the heck did they leave? To then live in, Arctic wastelands, so to speak. But if you look at, like almost any of these peoples that live in the far northern climates, they all have very similar stories of originally coming from a land of perpetual daylight and a lot warmer conditions than they live in now. Which, again, that goes back to this whole idea of the hollow earth with the center sun, because, if you have a sun that is suspended gravitationally in the center of the planet, it's never going to set. So you're going to be living in a place where it's, perpetual daylight, and probably a tropical environment where, it's always warm, until you start getting to the more northern areas of the sphere or north or south regions. There's a gentleman by Dr. Brooke Agnews.
Yes.
He has done some really excellent research, I think, on this whole idea. And, science postulates that the core of the planet is made up of, like a highly compressed nickel and steel and iron to the point where it's almost a completely different element because it's just so condensed by the pressures of the planet. And Dr. Agnew, he suggests that the interior of the planet could be hollow and that this nickel iron core of the planet the scientists love to talk about could actually be this internal sun, and that there is a pretty good sized cavity at the center of the planet, but that, our seismic readings that we use to deduce what the interior of the planet is made of is partially in error because I guess, as he puts it, some of these seismic readings, the evidence that they come out with seem the same type of material that they postulate is in the, like the center of the planet could also be statistically shown to be an open area rather than a crustal formation before you get to the iron core. So he says that the evidence shows that it could be, one way or the other. And of course, naturally, he likes to think that it shows that there's a hollow cavity down there.
Oh, yeah. Brooks is great. He was a previous guest, one of my favorites to talk about Hollow Earth. But sorry, go ahead.
No. Yeah, he's a great guy. He's done some really good research along these lines. And so I was just going to add that, naturally, I've never been down there. So, I can't say for sure one way or the other.
That's true.
I just offer the theories and my own, ideas based on these theories. And I always leave it up to the, readers or listeners to make up their own minds of the matter. Maybe one of these days, if we are able to get down there, we'll be able to prove it one way or the other. Hopefully,
That's the way to do it.
Mhm.
And you were talking about legends, and even the legend of Santa Claus comes from Scandinavia, and this idea that a man comes from the North Pole and brings gifts or supplies in the harshest of winter environments. I mean, that's the story. That's Santa. We've turned it into a materialism consumer fest with all these gifts that came from dear old Saint Nick, but the story itself is kind of in that vein of a guy coming from the northernmost point, the pole, perhaps from inside, and bringing supplies. I don't know. It's definitely interesting because so many of the legends of indigenous people who talk about another type of being, it's always about some kind of helper in most cases, like some kind of being that came and led them down into the earth during a cataclysm or brought supplies. So I just think that is an interesting part of modern culture that kind of harkens back to that idea.
Well, yeah, and you could take that a step further because the old stories of Saint Nicholas, he had his companion Krampus that came with him, and Krampus was always described as being almost like a demonic type of entity, and that's one of the other factors of the whole hollow inner Earth stories is that not only do you have races that live down there that are spiritually more developed than we are, but it's also the abode of, like devils and demons and creatures of the netherworld.
Mm-hmm.
The whole Richard Shaver hero stories goes in that direction. I mean, the Diros are basically the modern day equivalent of the devils and demons that love to torment us. So yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's very interesting how a lot of these mythologies are still with us today, albeit though in a kind of like a sweetened fairy tale types of versions.
Right.
But like the modern fairy tales, if you go and trace them back, you'll find that they have some realities to them, and oftentimes maybe not quite so pleasant realities.
Yeah, man. And Antarctica is another thing we were going to talk about because it is the most underexplored place on the planet, really, if you discount the oceans. And you'd really drown in red tape and regulation trying to get there. And it's been in a lot of alternative news lately. The Russian Patriarch, the Secretary of State, and Buzz Aldrin all invited down there recently to look at something. What are your thoughts on the story there? What do you think could be at the heart of this kind of provocative mystery?
It's really been interesting over the past year or so how much attention has suddenly been given to Antarctica. Like you said, I mean, you had former Secretary of State John Kerry and Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin going down there. You had Prince Harry. Did he go down there?
Yes.
I mean, and then, of course, Admiral Byrd back in the 20th century, the Patriarch of Moscow, like you said. What is going on down there, boy? And we can just speculate as much as you want to, and a lot of people have. Well, you go on the internet and Google up Antarctic mysteries, and man, you've got everything from the Nazi secret base to, like I said, the hollow Earth. I was on a show a couple of months ago, and the host of that show, he had a really interesting idea, and we talked about it quite a bit, and it was his idea that the Russians have been drilling into that lake, Lake Vostok, that has been covered in ice for, millions of years and basically sealed up whatever had been around in our environment at the time that it was finally covered over with ice. And it was his speculation that possibly that they discovered in that lake a life form that, for all intents and purposes, would be extraterrestrial. And what I mean by life form, I mean, more along the lines of, say, like bacteria or virus, or, not, not like an ancient astronaut still swimming around under there in a spacesuit, but something more along the lines of an ancient ancestor of ours. But this ancient ancestor, didn't originate on planet Earth. This, whatever this life form was, we are its descendants.
Like it was a remnant of panspermia or something.
Exactly. Around the time that this lake was covered over and that Antarctica found its way to where it was, because you have to realize that at one time, Antarctica was not located at the South Pole. I'm not quite sure where it was. I mean, it was definitely closer to the equator at one time. So it had more of a tropical environment. And, at some time in our ancient past, there was some kind of event. Nobody really knows for sure what happened, where basically, almost all life forms on this planet were killed. And that included the majority of undersea life forms as well. And then after a relatively short period of time, in geological history, there was a sudden explosion of life that came out of the seas. But this life was extremely bizarre. It didn't really resemble the previous life forms on the planet before whatever this cataclysmic event was, which has led some, scientists to speculate that this new life form, and when I say new life form, it was the seed that we're all descended from. All the life on the planet now descended from this new, rather bizarre forms of life that emerged after this cataclysmic event. Some scientists have speculated that this was a cosmic event, like possibly, say, like another sun came close to the edge of our solar system and disturbed the Oort cloud, sending comets racing into the interior of the solar system and then bombarding, Earth, Mars, Venus, everything. And that at that time, Mars probably had life on it. I mean, we know that it had an ocean and an atmosphere, and that when these comets bombarded Mars, they blasted off chunks of the planet, which then fell to Earth. I mean, we know that that's true because we have found Martian meteorites in Antarctica. They stand out very clearly. Of course, this is from, later events. So it could be that the new life that arose on Earth came from Mars and that we are the Martians, so to speak.
Yeah.
And this was the idea that this one person, suggested to me, which, that's pretty good idea, because I mean, I do believe in panspermia, like you said, the idea that the universe is teeming with life and that it's probably constantly, raining down on us from outer space in one form or another. And the idea that we evolved from some of these early dustings of life is not too far-fetched to me. And considering how long that Antarctica has been frozen over, and with the warming of our climate and the melting of the Antarctic ice, some of these primitive life forms may be coming out and being revealed, which could be why the sudden interest in Antarctica and why some of these people are going down there to check this out. I mean, hey, come and look at your great granddaddy. He's down here.
Yeah, man, I love it. It also kind of could give some clues as to why a lot of these people are ending up sick. There was a Lockheed Martin guy who got sick. There was also, of course, Buzz Aldrin. But right in this same vein, I took this down from Joseph Farrell's website, but he wrote about this recently, saying, as if it couldn't possibly get any stranger, there were also these stories several years ago that the Russians had found something near their installations at the vast under-ice lake, Vostok, where there were emergency evacuations at the time of people becoming suddenly sick. Perhaps the weirdest of all the stories was that the Saudis found something during an excavation around the Grand Mosque at Mecca, something which so terrified them that they turned it over to the Russians, who promptly, so the story goes, took it to Antarctica, where Patriarch Kirill performed ancient rituals over it. So that is provocative, of course, and it's just like what you were saying, something under Lake Vostok, possibly an ancient virus of some type, or maybe some type of ancient technology that is giving off some type of radiation, because if it's just a virus, I don't know, why John Kerry and Buzz Aldrin need to go look at it unless it might be something a little more epic to the eye.
Yeah, all of those stories, with the exception of the Saudis discovering something, because I don't think that they would be too inclined to give whatever they discovered to the rest of us,
Christians,
yeah,
basically.
yeah, well, yeah, the rest of us infidels, so yeah, so to speak, unless they just gave it to the. But then again, why would they give it to to the Russians if it was discovered, say, like in Syria or like one of these countries that is on a more friendly term with Russia, because Saudi Arabia is more friendly with the United States,
right?
But yeah, it's like I said earlier, Antarctica has not always been covered with ice.
Right.
And in fact, a number of writers have speculated that Antarctica may have been the location of what we would call Atlantis.
Right.
Now, some kind of antediluvian civilization that really existed long before modern civilization. And it's hard to say since it's now covered in, almost a mile, in most places, a mile thick ice sheet. But again, like I said, with the climate changing and Antarctica melting as fast as it has, it could very well be that some of the remnants of a lost civilization, and when I say a lost civilization, I mean a civilization that existed, more than 1,000,000 years ago, long before the last ice age. I mean, I couldn't tell you offhand how long Antarctica has been in its current location, but it's been, several million years at least.
Mm-hmm.
So if they have uncovered remnants of some kind of lost civilization in that location, we're talking about a civilization that existed supposedly long before modern man was even a gleam in a chimpanzee's eyes.
Right. And if you're going to the ancient aliens idea, I mean, people in that camp believe that something intelligent made us. So clearly there's some kind of intelligence perhaps in the background way before us.
Well, if there was going to be the remnants of an ancient civilization, Antarctica really is one of the best locations since it's been frozen for such a long period of time. I mean, all across the planet, we've seen possibly hints of remnants of some kind of civilization that existed before the last ice age. But naturally, due to erosion and other aspects, most of that has long since disappeared. However, Antarctica, being basically, frozen in stasis for so long a time, I mean, this really would be an excellent location to find remnants, if they actually existed, of a previous, possibly higher technological civilization that lived on this planet before we did. I mean, I am a firm believer that we are not the only technologically advanced civilization that has existed on this planet. I think that humans are probably a lot older than archaeologists give us credit for.
Yeah.
We're just now really discovering how many subspecies of humans have existed over the millenniums. I mean, we just recently discovered the Denisovians. It apparently seems to be an offshoot of the Neanderthals. I mean, we had no idea they existed, but once we discovered that little tiny finger bone in a cave in Siberia and got the DNA out of it, we discovered that there are still peoples, on this planet that have the genetic leftovers from this race, still in our genetic makeup. So, I mean, to me, it's not inconceivable that humans or human subspecies arose a lot longer on this planet, back that we care to think about. And that Homo sapiens sapiens is just really, I mean, we're just newcomers. Who knows what kind of, and I'm going to say hominid, because I guess I'm a little biased along those lines. But I suppose it's not inconceivable that other intelligent species could have evolved on this planet long before we did that weren't necessarily hominids. I know a lot of people will be like, it's just crazy talk. But, I mean, given the way that time works and that evolution works and the whole creative process in life works, I mean, it's not inconceivable that some of the first intelligent, technological-based civilizations on this planet may not necessarily have been human as we think of humans.
Right. Yeah. No, it's very, very conceivable. And of course, the further you go back, there's going to be diminishing returns for what you can actually unearth. So who knows how far back things go. And another great story you wrote about in the details of that book is the caves in Malta. And I found that so interesting. Can you tell us about what was found when they followed these caves and tunnels down as far as they did?
Oh gosh, I think you'll have to. I think you'll have to remind me.
I can. So
You have to realize, Greg, that a lot of these books, I mean, I write them and then, I go on to, like different books. So I may not remember all the details.
of course. Well, apparently, some men were digging a well, fell into the earth, found a cave system that opened up into multiple chambers, and they found that it was underneath a Neolithic village. And based on the stone carvings at the entrance to this lower section, once they got down in there, they believed that occasionally a human sacrifice was chained to the entrance every so often. I guess there's some kind of indications of that. But then down even deeper, they cleared out 30,000 skeletons from a passageway
Hmm.
and found old cave art murals behind them. And deeper still, you find what was called the oracle, a hole in the wall that when you would speak into it, it carried your voice throughout all of these caves. And the theory was that someone was using this amplification to maybe scare the villagers into offering sacrifices, or maybe tell them when they needed to bring one, otherwise they were going to have trouble. But if you go even further down from there, there was another room that had a stone altar in the center and beds carved into the walls. And in these little bed sections were little enclaves where people's heads would go or their feet would go. And the indications was that these beings were 4 feet tall or some even smaller. And then it opens up into natural caves, which nobody knows how far that goes. But I thought that was a pretty amazing story. I even looked up pictures of the Maltese cave art. And yeah, it's really interesting. And it almost is a parallel story to the idea of fairy folk underground, or some kind of smaller being underground, like coming up and stealing people. And maybe they worked out some kind of King Kong arrangement where they just give them a person once in a while to save themselves the trouble. But I love that story.
Well, and Malta is also the location of some very interesting roadways that seem to go out into the water. They start out on the land and then end going out into the ocean. So either these were boat docks of some kind, though it's unusual because these roads would also crisscross the island and then eventually, lead out into sea, leading some people to speculate that Malta is what's left of a larger land, again, harking back to the Atlantis idea. And of course, I mean, we give the idea of Atlantis anymore to really any kind of land that has sunk beneath the ocean. But if you look, I mean, you'll see that all across the globe, there's indications of this, that what now may be nothing more than just a little island, poking out from the ocean, at one time used to be something that was, a landmass that was a lot larger. But the whole Malta cavern situation is something that you'll also see in other locations around the globe. I mean, there are almost exactly the same types of situations where you'll have layer upon layer of caverns, with the oldest ones being the deepest. And some of these deepest caverns seem to show some kind of human or whatever type of activity, possibly even, before the last ice age, which, again, according to modern science, before that, I mean, humans were really nothing more than just brutes running around knocking each other in the head with rocks. No way having the sophistication to carve out these sophisticated cavern systems that we're finding, not only in Malta, but in other locations. And, you pointed out the idea that these caverns were acoustically perfect to the point where at a secret location, you could talk quietly and it would echo throughout the entire system, almost like a prehistoric PA system. There's other locations, there is a location in New England. I think it's in the American Stonehenge, where they have found some of these underground structures that if you go to a certain location and speak quietly, your voice can be heard throughout this limited area. Again, where it seems to be that, you had somebody like maybe like a priest system that would guide the population, for one reason or the other by pretending to be, spirits or gods or what have you. And that seems to be the situation that was going on in Malta. Some have speculated that you have these ancient locations, say like Malta or Egypt or even this fairly recently discovered location in Turkey, where they've discovered these really sophisticated megalithic structures and carvings that go really to the very, it seems to be the very beginning of mankind and even a little bit past from what we thought we knew, where there seems to have been maybe an outside influence going on from, and again, I mean, you have the ancient astronaut theorists who say that extraterrestrials from other planets came here and taught our early ancestors, the ways of civilization by either pretending to be gods or just, doing, what they would, and we just interpreted them as gods. Or it could be where you have remnants of an even earlier technological civilization that for one reason or another was destroyed or died or what have you, and that you had like these small groups of survivors that were scattered across the globe and then kind of restarted civilization from these locations. And I mean, Egypt, Malta, places in, like in China, South America, places like that seem to be like seeds. That's really a good way to describe it. They're like seed points where civilization restarted and then spread across the globe. So, I suppose it's a matter of interpretation whether or not, if you believe in ancient astronauts or ancient aliens, whether or not these seed points were brought about by visitors from other planets or if we're talking about remnants of a past civilization, kind of laying the groundwork for a new civilization. I'm not discounting the idea of ancient aliens or ancient astronauts. I think that is a good possibility, but possibly that was something that happened a lot further back than some of these more, and I say modern, and when I mean modern, I mean, just right after the Ice Age, the last Ice Age. But, I do think that we have been visited, in the past and probably still are by ancient aliens. I just think that some of these places like Malta that you were referring to could actually be starting points or restarting points of survivors of a past, but now, destroyed technological civilization.
Hell yeah, man. I'm right there with you. And man, Tim, I could do this all day, but that pretty much does bring us to the finish line. The world is full of weirdness, and you are doing your damn